In the halls of the Alpha King's palace, piercing screams echo without end. The raw, relentless cries of two newborn princes left behind by their mother. They say the queen fled with her lover, leaving the Alpha King shattered and her sons inconsolable. And now, the heirs to the kingdom reject every attempt at comfort. Every nursemaid fails. All healers are dismissed. Until Freya, a wolf-less, orphan servant, mocked for lacking what every shifter is born with. She was never meant to touch royal blood. Yet, when desperation drives her to the prince's side, something forbidden awakens. The crying stops. The princes grow calm in her arms. They cling to her scent and refuse all others. So the court is forced to confront an unsettling question: what kind of bond forms before words, before choice, strong enough to tie the fate of two alpha princes to a wolf-less servant girl? And how will the Alpha King react when he discovers his sons will not give up their lowly servant? Young Freya stood elbow-deep in dishwater so filthy it had turned the color of old meat. Chef Garrick wouldn't accept a pot until he could see his reflection in the bottom. Around her, the evening shift wound down in its usual chaos. Well-dressed house servants swept in with silver platters barely scraped, their fine livery somehow making the waste they carried seem almost noble. They heaved the platters into Freya's sink without so much as a glance in her direction. A wave of dirty water hit her square in the chest. Freya gasped, stumbling back as chunks of fat and gristle clung to her already stained apron. She looked up instinctively, some small, stupid part of her still expecting an apology. But the servant was already turning away, laughing at something his companion had said. "Hear those pups from the East Wing, now non-stop. The king hasn't slept in, not here." They disappeared through the doorway as Freya exhaled slowly and returned to her pot. "One day," she whispered to herself, "one day everyone else will see what he saw in you." "Who are you talking to?" The voice cut across the kitchen, and Freya's stomach dropped. She turned to find Elsa standing in the doorway, her clean apron spotless in a way Freya's never was. At 10, Elsa was 2 years younger than Freya, but she had a wolf. That made all the difference. "No one?" Freya said quickly. She kept her eyes on the pot in her hands, scrubbing harder even though the copper already gleamed. "Don't react. Don't give them the satisfaction." The apple core hit her temple hard enough to make her vision blur. She flinched, her hands jerking in the water, and the pot slipped from her grip and landed with a tremendous splash. More laughter. Not just the kids now. Some of the scullery maids had turned to watch. "Oi," Chef Garrick's voice boomed across the kitchen. "Clean yourself up and get out of my kitchen. Run, you're dripping all over my floor." "Yes, chef," Freya whispered. She grabbed a rag that reeked of onions and something sour and fled. Low, bitter laughter followed her into the corridor until she reached her bedroom. Well, bedroom was a big word. It had been a storage cupboard once, and there was space enough for a thin straw mat. Freya pulled the door shut behind her and stood in the darkness. From somewhere far above, muffled by stone and distance, came that sound again, thin and wavering. The crying. It never stopped. Not really. Sometimes it faded enough that you could almost forget it. But then it would surge back, piercing and relentless, a reminder that something in the palace was broken beyond anyone's ability to fix. Freya sank down onto her mat and wrapped her arms around her knees. And as always, when she needed comfort, she thought of him. Of the Alpha King, Lucius. She closed her eyes and remembered. She'd been small, 5, maybe 6 years old, and somehow she'd gotten lost in the palace gardens. And then he'd appeared, tall and golden in the afternoon light, dressed in hunting leathers. He'd knelt down in the grass beside her, and his voice had been so kind. "What's this?" "A little lost lamb." He'd scooped her up like she weighed nothing, settling her against his chest, and carried her all the way back to the kitchens himself. She remembered the way Hilda's face had gone white when she saw who was carrying Freya. The way Lucius had smiled and said something about keeping her safe, about finding her a place here despite her condition. Even then, Freya had known what he meant. Despite the fact that she had no wolf. "The king saved you," Freya whispered into the darkness. "The king saved you." It was proof. Proof that she wasn't worthless, no matter what the others said. If a king could see value in her, then maybe she wasn't nothing. Her thoughts drifted unbide into the crisis that had consumed the palace for weeks now. Queen Isolde had left. The Alpha King's own maid had abandoned him and their pups. Some said she'd taken a lover. Freya's hands curled into fists. How could she? How could anyone abandon King Lucius and those poor babies, left motherless? The crying seemed louder suddenly. Or perhaps Freya was simply more aware of it. How could she do that to such a good man? Freya whispered to the walls. And to her babies? No answer came. There never was one. Today Hilda was on breakfast duty. Freya felt it the moment she stepped into the kitchen the way the other servants kept their distance. Hilda had that effect. She didn't raise her voice, she simply had a way of looking at people that made them remember their manners. Two kitchen maids stood nearby, pretending to chop vegetables but clearly more interested in gossip. "My sister works in the family wing," one was saying. "She says it's driving everyone mad. The nursemaids are taking shifts now, for hours at a time, because any longer and they start weeping themselves." The conversation died, but not before Freya caught the tail end. No mother to soothe them. What do they expect? "You're late," Hilda said without looking up. "Wash your hands." Freya obeyed. A ball of dough waited for her, and she sank her hands into it gratefully. The crying was fainter here. The world was bearable. Then the door slammed open. A woman in a nursemaid's uniform came stumbling into the kitchen, her cap askew. "Hilda," the woman gasped. "Hilda, please, you have to help me." Hilda set down her dough and wiped her hands on her apron. "Catch your breath, Mora." But Mara didn't catch her breath. "The princes," she said, her voice cracking. "They won't stop screaming. We've tried everything. Everything, but they just keep crying, and nothing calms them. They're still at it, for weeks now since the queen left." "Quiet," Hilda snapped. She turned back to Mara and gripped the woman's shoulders. "What do you need? You're still nursing, are you?" Mara's hands clutched at Hilda's sleeves. "Please, we need someone to try. The wet nurses have all failed. The king is furious. He's threatening to dismiss the entire staff if we can't." Hilda's jaw tightened. "I'll come." As Hilda turned back to the counter, Freya felt something cold and heavy settle in her stomach. The pleasant morning was over. Hilda would leave, and Freya would be alone again. Unless... "Can I come?" The words were out before Freya could stop them. Hilda turned, one eyebrow raised. "What? Can I come with you? I can help. I can fetch things if you need them. Clean cloths or water or whatever the babies need." Hilda studied her for a long moment. "She can carry my supplies," Mara said. "But we need to hurry." "Please." Hilda sighed. "Fine. But you stay quiet, and you don't touch anything unless I tell you to." They left the kitchen at a near run, following Mara through the servants' corridors and up 3 flights of stairs to the family wing. Freya had never been this deep into the palace before. The halls were wider here, the floors polished marble instead of rough stone. But she barely noticed, because with every step they took toward the royal nursery, the crying got louder. It wasn't normal fussing. This was something else, raw and desperate and utterly inconceivable. The sound crawled under Freya's skin and settled in her bones. By the time they reached the nursery door, Freya's hands were trembling. Mara pushed the door open. 2 cradles sat in the center of an otherwise beautiful room carved from dark wood, draped with silk. And in those cradles, 2 tiny bodies writhed and screamed with raw desperation. 3 nursemaids huddled near the window, their faces haggard. They barely looked up when Hilda entered. "They've been fed," one of them said dully. Changed, burped, rocked. Nothing works. For hours, another nursemaid added, her eyes red-rimmed. 4 hours and then someone else takes over. Any longer and you start hearing them even when they're quiet. Hilda moved to the nearest cradle without a word. She lifted one of the babies, small, red-faced, his little fists flailing, and settled him against her chest. She murmured, swaying gently, "Hush now, little prince." The baby screamed louder. Hilda tried to nurse him. He turned his face away, wailing. She tried rocking him, singing to him. Nothing changed. In the other cradle, his brother shrieked in harmony. Freya's feet moved without permission. She crossed the room in a daze. She reached the second cradle and looked down at the tiny, furious creature inside. His whole body shook with the force of his cries. So Freya reached into the cradle and laid her hand on the baby's heaving chest. He went still. His eyes popped open wide and dark and startled. He stared up at Freya as if he'd never seen another person before in his short life. She didn't think. She simply opened her mouth and sang. It was the lullaby Hilda had sung to her when she was small, the only song Freya knew all the way through. Her voice was thin and unpracticed, but the baby's breathing slowed. His tiny fist uncurled and reached for her finger, and in the cradle behind her, the second twin's screaming stopped. "How?" Mara began, but she couldn't seem to finish the question. For the first time in 4 weeks, the royal nursery was completely, impossibly still. The nursery had gone so quiet that Freya could hear the clock ticking on the mantel. At last Mara breathed. Then, louder, "You're charmed, girl." One of the other nursemaids stepped closer. "For weeks we've tried everything. Wet nurses, rocking, songs, nothing. And you just walk in and—" Freya barely heard them. She couldn't look away from the twins, from Fenrir's long lashes casting shadows on his round cheeks, from Soren's rosebud mouth, slack in sleep. They loved her. She could tell. These perfect, royal, utterly precious things loved her without condition, without judgment. For the first time since the king had carried her from the garden all those years ago, Freya felt chosen. "Can you bring her back tomorrow morning?" Mara said to Hilda. "Please." Hilda's gaze was fixed on Freya, her expression unreadable. "Yes," she said finally. "We'll come back." And 1 year passed like water through cupped hands. 1 year of following Hilda through the servants' passages 3 times a day, of slipping into the royal nursery like a secret. Mara and Hilda had tried to guard Freya's involvement carefully. The other nursemaids were sworn to silence. But after a year, whispers followed Freya wherever she went. The king himself couldn't calm them, a servant once said, but a wolf-less kitchen girl can. "I heard they scream the moment she leaves the room," his friend replied. "A natural, that's what it is." No one could explain why 2 royal princes would come for a nobody, a nothing, a girl without even a wolf. Though Freya didn't care about the whispers. The king had saved her once, given her a place in his palace. And now, his sons needed her, chose her. She had Fenrir and Soren, and they had her. The morning sun was just cresting the eastern towers when Freya and Hilda slipped into the nursery. The moment the door opened, 2 small heads popped up from their shared crib. Fenrir saw her first. His whole face lit up, and he let out a shriek of pure joy, bouncing and slapping his hands against the crib rail. Soren joined in immediately, jumping and babbling excitedly. Freya's heart swelled so suddenly it hurt. "Good morning, my little terrors," she said, rushing across the room. She leaned over the crib rail and pressed kisses to the tops of both their heads. First Fenrir, then Soren. Behind her, Hilda tutted disapprovingly. Fenrir grabbed a fistful of her hair, while Soren tried to climb the crib rail to get to her. The moment she had them in her arms, they went soft and content. She caught a glimpse of Hilda watching from the doorway, her expression fond but deeply troubled. Freya set the twins down on the thick rug and began the morning routine, wiping faces, wrestling them into fresh tunics while they wiggled and squirmed. All the while she sang to them. The twins babbled along in their own language, making sounds that almost resembled words. Behind them, Hilda moved quietly through the room, tidying and organizing. After breakfast came playtime. The twins wanted to climb on Freya to play their version of Peak Wabe. She obliged, of course. She always obliged. When she finally captured them both and pulled them into her lap, they went willingly, settling against her like puppies seeking warmth. Within minutes, both of them were drowsy. Freya held them close and hummed softly, rocking slightly. This was her favorite part, when they were sleepy and content. When their whole world had narrowed down to her arms. She had never felt so needed, so utterly, completely loved. And she couldn't help but think the king must know. Maybe he would come to see for himself. Maybe he would recognize her and understand that she was meant to care for his sons. Maybe he would smile at her the way he had in the garden. "We need to talk," Hilda said quietly. They stepped out into the corridor, leaving the door cracked. "You're too familiar with the young princes," Hilda said. "You forget your place." "I know my place. It's by their side because they need me," Freya said, defensive. "No one else can calm them." "I know, but that doesn't change what you are. What they are." Hilda gripped Freya's shoulders. "You are a servant. They are princes. If the king finds out how attached you've become, there will be hell to pay." Freya pulled away. "His Majesty would be pleased that his sons are so well loved. He's so kind. He saved me once. He'd understand." "Freya," Hilda's voice held a warning. "Think about what you're saying. They need me. I'm special. Maybe this is why the king saved me." Hilda stared at her for a long moment. "You think the king will welcome you? Give you a place of honor?" Hilda shook her head slowly. "Those pups will grow. And where will that leave you? Heartbroken, cast aside. Or worse." "You don't know that," Freya said. "You are a servant, Freya. Never forget it." Hilda turned and walked back into the nursery, leaving Freya alone. But Freya couldn't bring herself to believe it, because deep down she'd been harboring a dream. She wanted the king to discover them, wanted him to see her with his sons, see how much they loved her so that he would love her too. He'd saved her once before. Surely he would understand. 3 weeks later, it was an ordinary morning. Freya had dressed the twins in matching outfits, and they'd promptly undone all her work by crawling away the moment she set them down. "Fenrir, come back here," he squealed and crawled faster. Freya lunged for him and he shrieked with laughter. Thorne, seeing his brother captured, crawled over at top speed, reaching for Freya with both hands. "Got you?" Freya gasped, laughing. "Got you, my little monsters." The double doors to the nursery slammed open and the laughter died in Freya's throat. King Lucius stood in the doorway, tall and golden and impossibly handsome, but his eyes were fixed on her with a look of such rage, such utter revulsion, that Freya felt her stomach drop through the floor. The twins, sensing the change in atmosphere, went still. "Let my children go." The king's voice was very quiet now. The king moved so fast Freya didn't have time to react. He grabbed one of the twins' cribs and hurled it across the room. It hit the far wall with a deafening crash, splintering into pieces. The twins shrieked. They clung to Freya with desperate strength, their small bodies trembling violently, their screams high and terrified. Fenrir buried his face in her neck. Soren's fingernails dug into her arm hard enough to draw blood. Freya wrapped her arms around them instinctively, staring at the king in absolute incomprehension. Why was he so angry? Was he under some kind of spell? The nursery doors burst open, and Hilda and Mara came running in. The king whirled on them. "Why?" he bellowed. "Does this servant child have her filthy hands all over my sons?" The twins were sobbing now, their small bodies heaving with each breath. Freya barely heard them. This was all wrong. What was her king saying? She pushed herself to standing on shaking legs, the twins still clinging to her. "Your Majesty," Freya said, "please try to understand. Your sons need me." His attention snapped back to her. The look in his eyes, cold, vicious, utterly devoid of warmth, froze the blood in her veins. "Need you?" His voice was soft now, worse than the shouting. "Why would the heirs to my throne need you?" He took a step toward her, and she instinctively backed up. "You are nothing. Less than nothing. You are a servant, and a wolf-less one at that," he snapped. "So get your filthy hands off my sons." Hilda and Mara seemed to snap out of their paralysis. "Sire," Hilda said, "the girl does have a sort of affinity with the children. I'll make sure she remembers her place, but perhaps get her out of here." The king roared. His sense sour and angry, the scent of an enraged alpha was stifling. "If I see her even look at my boys again, I'll have her whipped in the courtyard," he said, "and thrown from the palace to die in the woods like the worthless thing she is." Freya's knees gave out. She collapsed to the floor, the twins still clinging to her, and the sob that tore from her chest was animal in its rawness. "No," she gasped. "Please, please, I'll only come at night." "Freya," Hilda's hand closed on her elbow, trying to pull her up. "Come now." Mara took her other arm, and together they tried to lift her, but Freya couldn't make her legs work. "No," she sobbed. The king strode forward and grabbed the twins by their collars, yanking them away from Freya with such force that Fenrir nearly fell. The boys screamed. High, terrified wails that cut through Freya like knives. "Please," Freya reached for them desperately, but Hilda and Mara had her arms now, pulling her backward. The twins fought their father's grip, their little bodies thrashing, their arms stretched out toward Freya. They were crying so hard they could barely breathe. Then the doors closed and the sound became muffled, distant. But it didn't stop. Freya curled onto her side immediately, pulling her knees to her chest, and sobbed into her hands. Distantly she felt Hilda's rough palm against her hair. "I tried to warn you, child," she said. "They were never yours." The words should have hurt, should have cut, but Freya couldn't process them. I don't understand," she wailed. "Why was he so angry? I was helping them. They were happy. I made them happy." "Freya, maybe if I wrote him a letter to explain." Hilda's hand stilled in her hair. "Child, no. You cannot. Or maybe I could wait until he's calmer, and then go to him and remind him. Remind him that he saved me once in the gardens. Remember when I was little?" Josie listened to me, but Freya couldn't stop, the words spilling out faster now. "It's because the queen left, isn't it? He's upset about his mate leaving, and he saw me with his sons, and it reminded him. And that's why he was so angry. It has to be. Because he's a good man, Hilda. You know he is. He wouldn't hurt me on purpose. He gave me a home. So if I just wait until he's feeling better, until he's not so upset about Queen Isolde, then I can explain properly, and he'll understand, and he'll let me see them again." No, Hilda's voice was firm now, almost harsh. "No, Freya. He won't. But he has to." Freya sat up suddenly, tears streaming down her face. "The twins need me. Did you hear them? They were so scared, and they wanted me." She dissolved into fresh sobs, her whole body shaking. In that beautiful nursery, the babies were crying for her right now, and she wasn't allowed to go to them. So there had to be a way to fix this. There had to be. 3 days had passed since the king had thrown Freya from the nursery, and the twin screams had become part of the palace's architecture. Freya stood at the washing basin in the kitchen, her hands raw and wrinkled in the cold water. "Why doesn't she just go to them?" Someone whispered behind her, one of the scullery maids probably. Another voice hissed back. Freya's vision blurred. At least Hilda and Mara hadn't told anyone what had really happened in the nursery. The other servants knew only that Freya had been caring for the princes and was now forbidden from seeing them. They didn't know about the shattered crib, the king's rage, the terrible things he'd said. They didn't know that he'd called her nothing. Freya's hands stilled in the water. It didn't make sense. None of it made sense. The king had been so angrier than seemed possible for someone that was good and kind. He'd looked at her like she was vermin, but all she'd done was love his children. All she'd done was make them happy. There had to be a reason, some explanation she was missing. He'd been upset about something else, about the queen leaving, and he'd taken it out on her because she was there. Or maybe he'd been trying to protect her somehow. Freya, Chef Garrick's voice cut through her spiraling thoughts. That pot is clean. Move on to the next one. Yes, Chef, she whispered. Freya was just turning toward the corridor that led to her room when the kitchen door burst open. Have you heard the news? A footman said, stumbling in. Word from the north, Queen Isolde. She lives, she's raised an army. She's declared war to reclaim her sons. The kitchen exploded into shocked murmurs. Freya felt the words hit her like cold water. Through the sudden cacophony of voices, the twins' crying seemed to cut through even louder, more urgent, more desperate, as if they somehow knew. King Lucius has declared Queen Isolde a traitor, the footman continued. The whole palace is on lockdown. No one in or out until further notice. The murmurs died. The weight of that announcement settled over them like a physical thing. They were trapped. Trapped in a palace under siege with two inconsolable infants whose mother was coming to claim them by force. Freya lay on her thin mat in the darkness that evening, staring at the ceiling she couldn't see. She thought about Fenrir and Soren, alone in that nursery. Were there nursemaids with them? Was anyone holding them? Or were they just lying in their new crib, exhausted and terrified, crying themselves hoarse? I could help them, Freya thought desperately. Just for a little while. She sat up slowly, her heart starting to pound. It wasn't just for her. It wasn't even just for the twins. The whole palace was on edge. Surely the king would understand that. Surely he'd see that she was trying to help. Her feet were moving before she'd made a conscious decision. The nursery was dimly lit by a single lamp when Freya eased the door open. The crying hit her like a wave, louder here, more immediate, more desperate than she'd heard it in 3 days. The twins were in a new crib hastily constructed, not nearly as fine as the one the king had destroyed. The moment they saw her, they threw themselves against the bars, reaching for her with both hands, their faces red and raw and streaming with tears. They'd been left alone. There were no nursemaids in sight, no one to hold them or comfort them or even sit with them while they cried. Freya's heart cracked. Oh, little ones, she breathed, rushing across the room. She gathered them both into her arms, heavier now, solid and warm and trembling, and they clung to her with desperate strength. They pressed their faces into her shoulders and neck and made small, broken sounds that were somehow worse than the screaming. Hush, she murmured, rocking them gently. Hush now. The crying stopped. The twins sagged against her, their little bodies going limp with exhaustion. Within moments, their breathing had evened out. They were asleep, truly, deeply asleep, for probably the first time in a long time. Freya held them close, tears streaming down her own face. She knew she shouldn't linger. She'd done what she came to do. The twins were calm and sleeping. She should leave now before. I warned you. Freya spun around, her heart stopping. King Lucius stood in the doorway to palace guards flanking him. His rage wasn't explosive like before. Now it was cold, controlled. Surely you can see, Freya said desperately. I can help them. Take her, the king said to the guards. Rough hands seized Freya's arms while others seized the twins. They dragged her toward the door. Behind her, the twins stirred and began to cry again, frightened, confused sounds. Please. Freya twisted in the guard's grip, trying to see the twins one last time, but they were already pulling her into the corridor. The dungeon was cold and dark, and smelled of mold and old fear. The guards threw Freya into a cell without ceremony. "The king has given his order," he said flatly. "You'll be hanged for treason at dawn." A sound escaped her throat. She was 13 years old. She'd only ever wanted to help, to love, to be loved. How was that treason? Freya crawled to the corner of the cell and curled onto her side. All along she'd been wrong. The king had never been kind. He'd never saved her. She'd built an entire fantasy around a man who didn't exist, and now she was going to die for it. At some point, the wrought error had dulled into something more manageable, a hollow, numb acceptance. Freya was going to die. That was simply a fact. Now she sat with her back against the wall, knees pulled to her chest, waiting. Then came the soft padding and tiny whimpers. Freya's head snapped up. She crawled forward toward the bars. As she reached them, two small shapes appeared in the dim torchlight. Wolf pups. Tiny, fluffy, stumbling on legs that seemed too big for their bodies. Their fur was dark, and they couldn't have been larger than house cats. Freya's breath caught. "Fenrir," she whispered. "Soren, what happened to you?" The pups saw her face, and their whimpering transformed into excited yips. They tumbled over each other to reach her, their little paws skidding on the stone floor. Fenrir pressed his small nose through the bars and began licking at her fingers. Soren crowded in beside him, trying to wedge his entire head between the bars. A tear tracked down Freya's cheek. They'd shifted, but they were far too young. Impossibly young. Even Freya knew that children didn't shift until 8 or 9 years old. The earliest she'd ever heard of was 4. The twins weren't even 2. "You were distressed, weren't you?" Freya murmured. Soren tried to climb through the bars, his chubby puppy body getting stuck halfway. Despite everything, Freya felt a laugh bubble up. "You're ridiculous," she told them. "Both of you." Fenrir's nose twitched. He'd caught the scent across the corridor. He launched himself toward it, made it 3 steps, then his legs tangled and he tumbled snout over tail across the floor. Soren bounded after him, tripped over his own paws, and crashed directly into him. Both pups went rolling, fetching up against a tall stool. Freya's heart leapt. There, on top of that stool, something metal gleaming in the torchlight. Keys. And beside the stool, what had attracted Fenrir, a crust of bread. "The bread?" Freya called frantically. "Get the bread." Both pups lunged for it. They began a spirited tug-of-war, tumbling sideways and crashing into the stool leg. The stool wobbled. "Yes." Again, Freya encouraged desperately. But the pups had already forgotten the bread, wrestling and yipping instead. Freya made a high-pitched squeaking sound. Both pups froze and looked at her. "Come here," she called. They started toward her, but Fenrir got distracted by his own tail. Soren stuck his nose in a crack in the floor. Freya squeaked again. Soren bounded toward her cell, then veered off, spotting the bread crust. He grabbed it and shook it violently. Fenrir charged over to steal it. They collided near the stool again. The stool rocked dangerously. The pups dropped the bread, now trying to climb on top of each other. Soren went flying and crashed into the stool leg. The stool tipped. The keys flew through the air and hit the stone floor with a tremendous clatter. The pups jumped, startled, then investigated this new, interesting thing. Fenrir tried to pick the carrying up. It was too heavy. He dropped it, shaking his head. Soren batted it then with one paw. They jingled. He batted them again, harder. They slid across the floor, away from Freya. No, this way." Freya reached through the bars desperately. The pups wrestled right on top of them, oblivious to Freya's pleas. Then Fenrir got his paw angled in the carrying. He panicked and started backing up. The keys dragged along with him, jingling wildly. He backed directly toward Freya's cell. Soren grabbed the other end of the carrying in his teeth, pulling in the opposite direction. They moved in a chaotic sideways path that slowly brought the keys closer to Freya. Yes, keep going," Freya encouraged. Fenrir gave a particularly hard yank. Soren's teeth slipped and he tumbled backward right toward the cell. The momentum pulled Fenrir forward too. Both Pups and the keys ended up in a heap directly in front of Freya's cell. Freya's hand shot through the bars and grabbed the carrying. "Good boys," she breathed, tears streaming down her face. "Oh, you wonderful, silly, perfect boys." The Pups sat down, tongues lolling out, seeming immensely pleased with themselves. Freya fumbled with the carrying, her hands shaking. First key didn't fit. Second key didn't fit. The Pups started grooming each other. Third key, fourth key, fifth key. It slid into the lock with a soft click. She turned it. The cell door swung open. Freya dropped to her knees and the Pups immediately swarmed her, climbing into her lap, licking her face. "You saved me," she whispered, gathering them into her arms. Fenrir made a small, proud yet pink sound. Soren pressed his face into her neck and sighed contentedly. Freya stood on shaking legs and ran. She stumbled through the dungeon corridors, following the torchlight upward. The Pups were heavy, solid little bodies that squirmed occasionally, but they stayed mostly quiet. She pushed through the kitchen door and stopped dead. Hilda stood at the work table, a knife in hand. "Freya?" Her voice was barely above a whisper. "They said you'd been taken to the dungeon." Her gaze dropped to the Pups and her words died. Hilda set down the knife. "We need to get you out of here," she said, already moving. She grabbed a canvas pack and began filling it with supplies. "And those Pups need to go to their mother." Hilda spread a map across the table, tracing a route north. "I'm loyal to Queen Isolde. Always have been. She's gathering forces here, in the northern territories." Hilda's voice was firm. "The king is a dangerous man. He'll hurt you. He'll hurt his own sons. But the queen, she'll protect you. Take them. Go north." Freya's eyes filled with tears. "I'm scared. Please come with me." Hilda's face softened. "I'll stay. Let them off your scent. Buy you time. But you must hurry." She pressed the map into Freya's hand and helped settle the pack onto her shoulders. A warning bell began to ring somewhere above them. Hilda pulled Freya into a tight embrace. "Go," she said. "Be safe." Freya's voice broke. "You're my only family, Hilda. I love you." Hilda's eyes glistened. She brushed away a tear, then grabbed Freya's arm and pulled her toward a corner of the kitchen. She yanked aside a rug, revealing a trapdoor in the floor. "There's a passage," Hilda said, heaving it open. "It comes out beyond the palace walls. Head northwest into the forest. Don't stop." Footsteps echoed outside, voices shouting. "Thank you," Freya whispered, "for everything. Go, child." Hilda lowered the trapdoor, and the last thing Freya saw was her face before darkness swallowed everything. Freya stood in the darkness, clutching to wolf pups who had saved her life. "All right," she whispered to them. "Northwest. To your mother. To the queen." Freya fled through the dark forest, her heart torn in two. Behind her, somewhere in that palace, was Hilda, the only person who'd ever truly loved her. And Freya had left her there. The guilt was a physical weight in her chest, heavy as the pups in her arms and the pack on her back. But she couldn't stop. She had to get the twins to safety. The pups were heavier than she had expected. Solid, squirming weight that shifted constantly. The pack dug into her shoulders with every step, but she kept moving. Only when the forest grew dense did Freya finally slow. She fumbled for the map Hilda had given her. Northwest. Hilda had said northwest, but which direction was a hull cut through the night? Distant but unmistakable. Tracker wolves. The map crumpled in Freya's shaking hands as she shoved it back. No time. She had to run. The pups whimpered as she took off again. She held them tighter and pushed through the undergrowth. Behind her, the howls grew louder. Men's voices now, too. "Faster," she gasped to herself. "Come on, faster." But her legs were already giving out. Her knees shook with each step. Without the map, without any sense of direction, Freya knew she was getting lost. Through the trees ahead, amber eyes gleamed. Freya veered hard left, crashing through a thicket that tore at her clothes. The pups yelped in protest. She pleaded breathlessly, but they were frightened now, making distressed sounds that seemed impossibly loud. The snarls were gaining, the thud of paws on earth growing closer until Freya stumbled. She threw herself behind a massive oak tree and sank to the forest floor. This was it. This was as far as she could go. "Sh little terrors," she whispered, her voice shaking. But the pups were as scared. They whimpered and squirmed, their little bodies trembling. Through the darkness, amber eyes blinked, moved closer. The growls of tracker wolves surrounded them, 3, maybe 4, circling the oak tree. Freya pressed her back against the rough bark. She didn't stand a chance. The pups' whimpers grew louder. They couldn't help it. They were babies, terrified and exhausted. Then a massive shadow moved through the undergrowth. The tracker wolf nearest to Freya turned toward the movement, and a wolf unlike any Freya had ever seen exploded from the darkness. He was huge, easily twice the size of the palace trackers, with a scarred muzzle. He slammed into the first tracker with enough force to send it flying. The attack was savage, merciless. Another tracker leapt onto his back, but he shook it off, sending it crashing into a tree with a sickening crunch. Freya pressed herself harder against the oak, her eyes wide with terror. Palace guards burst through the undergrowth, swords drawn. "Rogue wolf, kill it." The lone wolf reared up and released a howl that seemed to shake the very trees. The guards stumbled backward, their swords wavering. The lone wolf dropped to all fours and charged. The guards scattered, crashing through the undergrowth. Then there was silence. The tracker wolves were either dead or fled. The guards were gone, and the massive, scarred wolf turned toward Freya's hiding spot. His eyes, pale gold in the moonlight, locked on hers. He took a step forward. Freya bolted. She didn't think, just grabbed the pups tighter and ran. Behind her, she heard a surprised huff, almost like a laugh, and then paws giving chase. The wolf was faster, but he wasn't attacking. He was just following. Freya spotted a cluster of large boulders and dove for them, wedging herself into a gap. The space was barely big enough, but she squeezed in. For a long moment there was only silence. Then the sound of bones cracking. The distinctive sound of a shift. Freya pressed her hand over her mouth. The pups, exhausted, had finally gone quiet. "Well," a deep male voice said nearby, tinged with amusement. "That's one way to thank someone for saving your life." Freya didn't respond. The voice continued, casual. "Those palace wolves were about to tear you apart, kid. Can't say I've ever been run away from quite so enthusiastically after a rescue." There was rustling fabric. He was getting dressed. "You can come out now," the voice said. "I'm not going to hurt you. If I wanted to, I would have left you to the trackers." Freya stayed frozen. A long sigh. "All right then. Let's see." Footsteps circled her hiding spot once, twice, then they stopped directly in front of the gap. A man's face appeared in the opening. He was probably in his 40s, with long, unkempt hair streaked with gray, but his eyes, those pale wolf eyes, were sharp with something that might have been kindness buried beneath the weariness. "There you are," he said mildly. "What are you doing wedged in there? Can't be comfortable." Freya stared at him, trembling. He studied her, then his expression softened. "I'm not going to hurt you. I just saved you from trackers who very much wanted to hurt you. Remember?" Freya's voice came out as a croak. "You killed them." The man shrugged. "Some of them," he said without apology. "They were hunting a child carrying babies. I don't take kindly to that sort of thing." Freya's arms tightened around the twins. The man noticed and huffed a soft laugh. "Easy, Mother Wolf. I'm not going to take them from you." He settled on the ground a few feet away. "I'm Thorne." "What's your name?" When Freya didn't answer, he shrugged. "That's all right. But you should probably come out of there. Those guards will regroup eventually. How do I know you're not going to take me back to the palace? Freya asked. Thorne's expression hardened. Because I'd sooner cut off my own arm than help that bastard king with anything. The venom in his voice was real raw. So slowly, cautiously, Freya began to edge out of her hiding spot. Freya stared up at Thorne's tall form, her heart hammering. She wanted so desperately to trust him, but trust had gotten her nothing but pain before. You don't like King Lucius? She asked, her voice barely above a whisper. Thorne snarled. The king has no honor. I'd rather have no pack than belong to his. Emboldened by his clear hatred of the man, Freya took a chance. She shifted the twins slightly in her arms. They drifted off to sleep during her hiding. They're the king's sons, she said, nodding down at them. I need to reunite them with their mother. Her voice broke slightly. Will you? Will you help me? Thorne glanced down at the sleeping boys, then back at Freya. Those are the princes, he asked, stunned. Freya nodded. And they're here alone with a 10-year-old? Bram asked, dumbfounded. Freya huffed. I'm nearly 13, and I'm all they have. She looked down at the sleeping pups. And they're all I have. Something shifted in Thorne's expression. He groaned, then snatched her map and studied it briefly in the moonlight. I'll walk you to the river crossing, he said gruffly. About half a day's journey from here. But after that, kid, you're on your own. Relief flooded through Freya. Thank you. Don't thank me yet, Thorne said, already turning deeper into the forest. We've got a lot of ground to cover before dawn. Can you walk? The river crossing came and went. Thorne didn't leave. The water's too fast here, he'd said, barely pausing. We'll need to go upstream. Another few hours. Those few hours turned into a full day. Then another. There's a village near here, Thorne announced on the third morning. Royal sympathizers. We'll need to go around. That'll add another day, maybe two. By the end of the first week, Thorne still hadn't left them. Freya stopped questioning it. She simply accepted that Thorne was staying, at least for now. The days fell into a rhythm that was almost peaceful. Thorne taught her how to set proper snares. At night, they slept in a formation that felt sacred. Thorne stretched out in his massive wolf form, Freya with her back against his warm flank, and the twin pups curled against her stomach. One morning, Freya watched in horror as Fenrir discovered a rabbit snare Thorne had set. The little pup approached it cautiously, then pounced. The snare collapsed immediately, and Fenrir found himself tangled in cord and sticks. He yelped, thrashing. Soren rushed over to help and promptly got tangled himself. Within seconds, both pups were a yipping, rolling ball of fur and rope. Freya rushed over, but Thorne was already there, kneeling down with surprising patience. His large, scarred hands worked gently through the tangles, freeing one pup, then the other. Easy little warriors, he murmured. You've conquered the fearsome rope trap. Very impressive. Fenrir, finally freed, shook himself indignantly and immediately tried to attack the remains of the snare. Thorne's lips twitched. He glanced up at Freya, who was trying hard not to laugh. They're going to destroy every trap I set, aren't they? He asked. Probably, Freya admitted. Thorne sighed. That night, after the twins had fallen asleep, Thorne fed another stick into their fire. We'll reach the foothills tomorrow, he said. After that, it's maybe 3 more days to the northern territories. Freya's heart sank. And then, you'll leave? Thorne didn't answer immediately. He poked at the fire, sending sparks spiraling up. I left Lucius's pack when he banished my brother, he said finally, his voice low. My brother was injured in one of the king's wars. Took a wound that never quite healed right. He couldn't shift properly anymore. He shook his head. Lucius said he was too weak. Freya watched him in the firelight, seeing the pain in his face. I should have left with him that day, Thorne continued. But I stayed. Told myself I was a man of honor. A few weeks later, I found my brother dead. He looked up at Freya, his eyes fierce. If I'd left when my brother needed me, he'd still be alive today. Freya's eyes burned. The Alpha King destroys anyone he deems unworthy, Thorne said, his voice rough. But I won't let that happen to you. I won't let any harm come to you or those boys. Freya believed him. Get some sleep, Thorne said. We've got a long walk ahead of us tomorrow. She was just drifting off when the first howl echoed through the trees. Freya's eyes snapped open. Thorne was on his feet instantly. Get behind that tree. Take the pups and the supplies. Stay down. Freya grabbed the pack and scooped up both pups. Through the trees she could see shadows moving. Tracker wolves, at least 4 of them, and guards with torches and swords. Thorne surged to his feet and launched himself at the first tracker wolf before it could enter their camp. The fight was brutal. One of the guards broke through, heading straight for Freya. Without thinking, Freya kicked the dying embers toward him. The hot coals scattered across his face, and he screamed. Thorne was on him in an instant, driving his branch into the man's chest. The others fled, but then Thorne made a sound. A low groan of pain that sent ice through Freya's veins. She scrambled out from behind the tree. Thorne had fallen to his knees, one hand pressed to his side. Blood seeped between his fingers, darkened too much. Josie, Freya said, her voice rising. It's not healing. Why isn't it healing? Thorne ground out through clenched teeth, poisoned. What do we do? Thorne tried to push himself upright and failed. There will be more. They'll have heard the fight. You need to rest. It's not safe. He tried again. We keep moving. Now. Freya stared at him. All right, she said, her voice steadier than she felt. We move, but I'm helping you walk. Thorne gripped her arm and levered himself to his feet. He swayed, and Freya braced herself to take his weight. Together they stumbled forward into the dark forest. They would make it. They had to. They stumbled forward across terrain that had finally flat and rocky and sparse, but blessedly clear after weeks in the dense forest. Thorne walked beside Freya, leaning heavily on her shoulder. Every step seemed to cost him, his face gray with pain and exhaustion. But they were so close now. She looked up and saw it spread across the wide valley ahead. A massive camp. Dozens of canvas tents, cook fires sending black smoke into the gray sky. Figures moving with purpose between the structures. An army. Thorne, she said, her voice cracking. I think we're here. Thorne lifted his head with visible effort. They pushed forward, one agonizing step at a time. The camp was a hive of activity. Soldiers sharpening weapons, armor smiths hammering at forges. Scouts reporting in. No one noticed them at first. Somebody, Freya called out, her voice cracking. Please help. A few soldiers glanced their way but didn't stop. Please, Freya shouted, putting every ounce of strength she had left into her voice. More heads turned. People started to notice this filthy girl supporting a bleeding man and wolf pups. At that moment, Thorne's legs gave out completely. He collapsed, his weight pulling Freya down with him. They all hit the rocky ground hard. Thorne didn't make a sound, didn't move. Suddenly, people were rushing toward them. Soldiers, camp workers, a woman in healer's robes. The twin pups scrambled to Freya, whining with fear. A woman with gray streaked hair knelt beside Thorne, turning him onto his back. She glanced at Freya with sharp eyes. What happened, child? She asked. Freya's words tumbled out. We were attacked by King Lucius's army. Thorne fought them off, but one of the guards had a poison blade. The woman examined Thorne's wound, pulling aside his blood-soaked shirt. I need to find the queen, Freya said desperately. The twins need. Someone fetch her majesty, the woman called over her shoulder. A soldier sprinted away. What's your name, girl? Freya, she said. I'm Piandra. I'm going to help your friend. Soldiers appeared with a canvas stretcher and carefully lifted Thorne onto it. His eyes were closed, his face ashen, but his chest still rose and fell. Meanwhile, Pianra glanced at the twin pups. Unusual to shift, so young. Freya pulled them closer protectively. They're special. Before Pianra could respond, a powerful feminine voice cut through the gathered crowd. "What's the meaning of this?" it asked. The crowd parted. The queen appeared. Freya immediately knew it was her. Tall and regal and beautiful even in fighting leathers. Her dark hair pulled back in a severe braid. Her eyes swept the scene, then locked on the twin pups pressed against Freya's legs. Recognition and disbelief flashed across her face. Her hand went to her mouth, her eyes filled with tears. Then she was running. She dropped to her knees and gathered both wolf pups into her arms. "My babies," she sobbed. "My babies, you've come back to me." She held them and wept, her whole body shaking. The pups pressed closer, nuzzling against her, their tails wagging slightly. They recognized their mother's scent instantly. The entire camp had gone silent. "Who?" She pulled back, her voice thick with emotion. "Who brought you back to me?" Freya found herself suddenly visible as the queen's gaze locked on her. Her face went absolutely white. "You," she whispered. Fear trickled cold down Freya's spine. "They were lost without you," she hurriedly said. "I tried to keep them safe. I'm sorry if I did something wrong." Isolde reached her and cupped Freya's face in both hands. Her touch was warm, careful. Her eyes were filled with tears. "You brought my sons back to me," Isolde said, her voice trembling. "I tried," Freya managed. Up close, Freya could see the queen's hands shaking. See the way her eyes searched Freya's face with an intensity that bordered on hunger. The queen pulled her into an embrace. Freya went stiff with shock, but the queen held her with the same desperate relief she'd shown her sons. "Thank you," Isolde whispered against Freya's hair. When they pulled apart, Isolde kept both hands on Freya's face. "What's your name, child?" she asked, her voice strained. "Freya?" The queen flinched as if the name had struck her. "Freya," she repeated. "How old are you, Freya?" 13, I think." Isolde's eyes closed briefly. When they opened, they were swimming with tears. She pulled Freya close again, pressing a kiss to her forehead. Behind them, Pianra called out urgently. "Your Majesty, the wounded man. We need to get him to the healing tent immediately." Isolde pulled back but kept one hand on Freya's shoulder. "Who is he?" she asked. Freya's voice broke. "Thorne. He helped us. Protected us." Fierce determination flashed across Isolde's face. "Take him to my personal healer," she commanded. "Use whatever you need. I want him alive." Pianra nodded and followed the soldiers carrying Thorne's stretcher. Isolde turned back to Freya, brushing a strand of dirty hair from her face. "You must be exhausted. When did you last eat?" "Sleep." Freya couldn't remember. "I'm fine. The twins are home now." Isolde smiled through her tears. Her hand trembled against Freya's cheek. "And so are you. You're home too." Freya frowned. All she could think about was Thorne lying pale and still on that stretcher, and the twin pups pressed warm against her sides. They were here. They were safe. And the queen had held Freya like she was something precious. Freya didn't understand any of it. Freya woke to the warmth of two small bodies pressed against her chest. The twin pups were curled together on top of her, their soft breathing steady and peaceful. And sitting in a chair beside the bed was Queen Isolde. Freya's heart jumped. Isolde raised a hand gently. "These are safe here." Freya settled back against the pillows, her arms instinctively curling around the twins. The queen's expression softened. "Thank you again. I don't think I can ever thank you enough for what you've done." Freya nodded politely, not trusting herself to speak. Isolde studied her face and frowned. "Is something the matter? Are you still hungry?" cold? Do you need anything?" Freya shook her head, looking away. She stroked the pup's soft fur, focusing on the feel of it beneath her fingers rather than the queen's searching gaze. She wanted to ask about Thorne, but she didn't know if she had the right to demand anything from a queen. Isolde's voice was gentle. "It's all right, child. If there's something you need, you can tell me." Freya hesitated. She'd trusted a king before, built her whole world around his supposed kindness. She wouldn't be that foolish again. But Isolde reached out slowly, and Freya flinched back before she could stop herself. The queen froze. Her scent changed, not angry, but sad. Painfully sad. Isolde withdrew her hand. "I apologize. I didn't mean to startle you." Freya swallowed hard. The queen didn't smell angry. Didn't look threatening. She looked down at the pups worriedly, and the words came out small and frightened. "They haven't switched back." Isolde leaned forward slightly. "What do you mean?" Freya's throat tightened. "Not since we left the castle. They've been pups the whole time, and I don't know why. And I—" Her voice cracked, tears burned in her eyes. Freya cried out, "I should have made them feel safe. I should have done better." Isolde's voice was firm but not unkind. "Stop. This is not your fault." Freya shook her head. "But I was taking care of them." "They're—" Isolde said, her own voice thick with emotion. "They're babies. Babies who were taken from their home, from everything they knew. Babies need stability, security, familiar surroundings. Of course they were scared. Not even their own mother, a queen with an army, could have prevented that." She paused. "So it is certainly not your fault. Do you understand me?" Freya wiped at her eyes with the back of her hand. "The queen said you were incredibly brave. You saved them. You kept them alive and brought them home when no one else could have. I am so—" Her voice broke. She whispered, "I am so proud of you." The words settled around Freya like a warm blanket. She didn't understand why the queen looked at her like that, but something in Freya's chest loosened. Freya asked quietly, "May I see Thorne? I need to know if he's going to be all right." Surprise flickered across Isolde's face, but she recovered quickly. "How about you rest for a bit longer? I'll go check how he's doing and ask the healer if you can visit him later." "All right." Despite the tension still coiled in her stomach, Freya found herself nodding. Isolde stood. "Good. Sleep. You're safe now, I promise." Freya tried to stay awake, but the bed was so soft and the twins were so warm that sleep pulled her under like a tide. When she woke again, the tent was darker, and Queen Isolde hadn't returned. Freya carefully extracted herself from beneath the sleeping pups. She had to find Thorne, had to see for herself that he was all right. Freya slipped out and let her nose guide her. Even without a wolf of her own, she could track Thorne's scent. It led her to a larger tent on the far side of camp. Inside, a soldier sat sleeping near the entrance. Beyond him, rows of cots held injured soldiers, and at the very back she could see Thorne. He was lying unconscious, his chest bare and bandaged. And beside his cot, bending down to check his wound, was Queen Isolde. Freya froze. Suddenly, Thorne's eyes snapped open. His hand shot out, and he pressed a knife against Isolde's throat. "Where are the kids?" he growled. Isolde didn't flinch. She reached up slowly and gently removed his hand from her throat. "They're safe. Sleeping," she said calmly. She helped ease Thorne back down as he blinked at her, clarity slowly returning to his eyes. "You're the queen," he sighed. "The twins' mother." Isolde nodded. Thorne stared at her for a long moment, his brow furrowing. Have we met before?" he asked. "No, I don't think so." "Why?" "Your scent. It seems familiar somehow," Thorne said, sounding confused. Then he seemed to remember himself that he was lying in bed, having just held a knife to a queen's throat. "I apologize," he began. "I didn't mean to." "No apologies necessary," Isolde interrupted. You were protecting my children even unconscious. She paused. I owe you a great debt, sir, for bringing them all back to me. Thorne shrugged uncomfortably. It was all Freya. She got them out of the palace. She kept them safe. She's one brave kid. Isolde tensed visibly at his words, though her expression remained neutral. Yes, she nodded. She is. Thorne studied the queen's face. What are you planning to do with her? He asked. What do you mean? Thorne pushed himself up to sitting, despite the obvious pain it caused. She brought you back your pups. Great. Happy for you. But now, what's going to happen to her? Freya's breath caught. She pressed herself closer to the tent wall, her heart hammering. I don't plan to send her back to the king, if that's what you're wondering, Isolde said. Glad to hear it, sweetheart, Thorne snapped. But there is a world of difference between not being sent to her death and being properly taken care of. She's just a kid. She'll be needing guidance. Guidance, Isolde repeated. You know what I mean, Thorne met her eyes. Someone to look out for her, care for her. I assure you, the child will be well taken care of, Isolde said, looking away. Thorne sighed. Right. But the kid's been through a lot. It's not just about giving her food and shelter. What are you saying? Isolde asked quietly. I could take her, Thorne met her eyes again. Take care of her. I'll do it. Freya's hand flew to her mouth, holding back a gasp. You do that? Isolde asked, sounding genuinely touched. Thorne shifted uncomfortably. Well, somebody has to. Might as well be me. Isolde was quiet for a long moment. When she finally spoke, her voice was gentle but firm. That's very kind of you to offer, she said. Not truly. But it's one I cannot accept. Freya will stay here with me. Why? Thorne frowned. Did you even ask her if she... Because she is mine, Isolde interrupted. Thorne just gaped at her. Freya is my daughter, Isolde continued. From her hiding spot, Freya felt the world tilt sideways. You're serious, aren't you? Thorne stammered. You said yourself my scent reminded you of someone, Isolde pointed out quietly. Thorne's eyes widened as realization crashed over him. You're saying... Freya is a princess, and that is why you smell like her. Isolde confirmed. Yes, she said. A princess. And King Lucius's firstborn child and heir. One he rejected the moment he discovered she couldn't shift. Freya staggered backward, her hand pressed to the tent wall for support. The king who she'd idolized. He was her father. When Freya was born without a wolf, it didn't matter to me. I loved her, Isolde said. She was beautiful. Mine. But Lucius... Her voice hardened. Lucius was furious. He demanded that our daughter be killed. Said she was defective. An embarrassment. Freya couldn't breathe. I begged him for her life, Isolde continued. I said I would try to give him full shifter pups, would keep trying. But only if he let her live. And he agreed, Thorne asked. Yes, Isolde's voice cracked. But to keep me compliant, he took her from me. Freya, my baby. Fresh tears ran down her face. I wasn't allowed to hold her, or nurse her, or even see her. Not until I gave him his heir. His proper heir, the queen explained through her tears. I was a prisoner in my own palace for 12 years. Endured miscarriage after miscarriage, all while my daughter lived floors below me, and I couldn't even speak to her. Thorne cursed. Bastard. That absolute bastard. But it wasn't enough, Isolde said, her voice hollow. When the twins were born, when I'd finally given him what he wanted, he still wouldn't let me see her. I realized then that he never intended to keep his word. That Freya, that none of my children were safe. So I tried to escape with all 3 of them. I was caught. Isolde's voice was flat. Lucius had me arrested for treason. Was going to execute me in front of the entire court. But those loyal to me, servants like Hilda, they helped me escape. Freya's heart lurched at Hilda's name. I fled to my family, my old pack, Isolde finished. Gathered an army. Declared war. Not for the throne, I don't give a damn about the throne, but for my children. Silence fell. Freya stumbled backward, her hand falling from the tent wall, and turned to run. But she only made it a few steps before a hand caught her shoulder gently. Freya? She turned. Isolde stood there, tears streaming down her face. Their eyes met. Is it true? Freya asked. Isolde nodded, and Freya began to cry, great heaving sobs that tore from her chest. You have to keep fighting, she said. You have to stop him. For Hilda. For everyone he's hurt. I will, Isolde swore. I promise. Freya threw herself into her arms. The queen caught her, holding her close, and they both wept. For the years they'd lost. For the cruelty they'd endured. For Hilda's sacrifice. For everything that had been stolen from them. But also for the impossible fact that, despite everything, they'd found each other again. Thorne's recovery was slow but steady, and Freya visited him every day. At first she'd come alone, slipping into the healing tent to sit beside his cot and tell him stories about the twins. But as the days passed, she noticed she wasn't always his only visitor. One evening, as the sun dipped low and painted the canvas walls amber, Freya approached the healing tent to find Isolde already there. The queen sat beside Thorne's cot, sleeves rolled up, carefully unwrapping the bandages around his torso. Thorne was watching her face with an expression Freya had never seen on him before. You're terrible at following orders, you know that? His voice was teasing. Isolde said something too quiet for Freya to hear, and Thorne huffed a laugh that made him wince. Pretty sure I told you to stop fussing and let the healers do their job, he said. And I'm pretty sure I told you to stop being so stubborn. Thorne caught her wrist gently. I'm serious, Your Highness. You don't need to. I want to. Their eyes met and held, the air between them thickening with something warm and weighted. Freya felt suddenly like an intruder. A smile tugged at her lips as she turned away. She found the twins exactly where she'd left them. 2 wolf pups sprawled on a blanket outside Isolde's tent, playing with carved wooden animals. They'd finally shifted back to their human forms a week after arriving at camp. Freya had woken to find 2 small boys instead of pups, and she'd nearly cried with relief. Now they switched back and forth constantly, as if making up for lost time. Soren spotted a butterfly landing on a nearby flower and pointed his nose at it urgently. Yes, I see it, Freya said. It's very pretty, but you have to be gentle. Too late. Soren bounded after it. Fenrir gave chase. Within seconds, both pups were tumbling through the grass, yipping excitedly. Freya laughed and lay back on the blanket, letting the last warmth of the sun wash over her face. Above her, the sky turned from gold to pink to deep purple. She heard footsteps and opened her eyes to find Isolde standing over her, silhouetted against the sunset. How is Thorne? Freya asked. Healing well. There was something soft in Isolde's eyes. Stubborn as ever, but healing. They sat together in comfortable silence. Eventually, both pups tired themselves out and trotted back. Soren curled up in Isolde's lap, and Fenrir flopped against Freya's side with a dramatic sigh. As darkness settled and the stars wheeled overhead, Thorne made his way slowly from the healing tent. He settled himself on the grass beside the blanket with a low groan. Should you be up? Freya asked. Should you be mothering me? Thorne countered. Fenrir yipped happily and scrambled over to climb into his lap. Thorne winced but helped the pup, settling him carefully against his chest. You're getting heavy, little warrior. Soren lifted his head from Isolde's lap and whined softly. I stay with your mother, Thorne said. There's not enough lap for both of you. Freya watched them exchange a look over the pups' heads, something warm and knowing passing between them. Then Isolde smiled at Freya. They love you, she said, looking at the twins. They trusted you when they couldn't trust anyone else. Because I smelled like you, Freya said, her voice thick. Because you are their sister, Isolde corrected gently. The fire crackled between them, sending sparks spiring into the star-filled sky. Freya looked at her small, fierce family. Isolde beside her. Soren sleep. Thorne with Fenrir curled against his chest. Tomorrow would bring more preparations for war. King Lucius wouldn't surrender easily. But tonight, for this one perfect moment, they were just a family.